Welcome one, welcome all to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Today I am talking about pantsing, which is, obviously for those that don't know, a way of approaching long-form writing as opposed to plotting or pantsing, which is kind of a spot between both. As always, I'm not here to give writing advice. This is just me talking about my craft and my process and what works for me. If it works for you too, that's great. If it doesn't, that's not my problem. This is not a space to bash other writers and their process, and doing so will result in you being banned whether you like it or not, whether you agree with my process or not. It's not the point of this podcast. This podcast is supposed to be a nice space. I know this debate can get very heated and very toxic very quickly. We're not having any of that here, thank you very much. And if you are that way inclined, and you just can't deal with other people having different process and way of working to you, then frankly you just need to grow up. But all that aside, let's get into the process that I use. So I mentioned before in my introductory episode that I was formerly a hardcore plotter. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that looked like to me. When I say I'm a former hardcore plotter, this is really before I even tried doing long form. This was when I was just doing shorts, and really when I was quite young. And I, to be honest, I'm not quite sure how it came about that I was a plotter, other than that it was just what I'd heard from people elsewhere, that they would make a mind map for their stories and then write them. So I guess I assumed that was the done thing. And I always wanted to be a bit better than everybody else. I'll put it out there, I always wanted to be the best. So I thought, okay, so the best story has to be the most thoroughly plotted out, right? So I would plot out absolutely everything, who my characters were, full on, character sheets, who would die at the end of which page number, and how that would happen, how people would react to that, all kinds of things. And this would usually be with ensemble casts, because, I don't know, really, I guess I always just liked that. And this would be for stories that were, 2 sides of A4, which at the time, because my writing was bigger back then, probably would have been 800 to 1.1k. So it was, and I'd have more than that in the number of pages of plotting. I'd have 2 or 3 pages of plotting for that, and it was just ridiculous. And I did end up writing a couple of stories using that sort of process, and what that ended up being was, it was just really predictable and bland. There was also very little actual character to it. It was just all plot, no vibes, no character, no nothing. It was just X thing happens, X thing happens, X thing happens, no proper emotion. So it just, everything felt very, very stilted. And then, I was aware of that. Excuse me. And people also told me that. And it really kind of knocked my confidence, but I didn't really realise there was another way of doing things for a long time. So in the end, I'd just end up plotting all this stuff out, and then I'd think, oh, but isn't this just bland and predictable? And then I'd never actually write anything. Ever, at all. And to be honest, I think that's probably what stopped me writing for years and years and years. Because I just really wasn't happy with what I was making. At all. So then when I did get involved with the in-person writers group that I mentioned in the introductory episode, and they wanted me to write shorts, and I just thought, well, you know what, fuck it, let's just write something. Let's not think, let's just do. And hey presto, I could just actually write something. And, I'll be honest, my first piece I wrote for them was something that I would cast into the fires of Mount Doom because I hate it, but it was something that, genre-wise, I'd never tried before. It was sort of, I don't want to say supernatural, because it technically wasn't, but it did have quite an ethereal, sort of magical nature, but not fantasy type deal to it. I really just don't know what to categorize it as. I guess maybe magic realism, or is it fabulism that people say now instead? I don't know, to be quite honest. I don't move in those circles. But it was something I never tried before. It was something I actually really enjoyed writing, and it would never have occurred to me to write as a plotter. So I thought, hang on, there's something here. And I kept on with that kind of process of just going into something with no idea, literally no idea of what was going to come out, and after a couple of shorts and things, I started making things I actually liked. At least the sort of the pre-rough stoned version of it. I thought, hey, this is actually pretty decent. And since then I have decided to use sort of more of a self-prompt for myself, so I'll think, okay, I want to write something about X thing, whether that be I want to write something, for example, with a sort of military aspect to it, or with a character who's like this, or in this situation, or in this sort of place. And it will literally just be one sentence like that. For example, I want to write about a character in a snowy pine forest. And I'll just go from there and I'll just start writing. That's as far as it goes. It ain't that deep. Quite literally, it really ain't that deep. And that's what works for me. And this art piece on the side, for those who are watching the video content, is called Plot Threads. It's one I did, it might have been the first one I did this year, thinking about it. Don't hold me to that, it might not be true. But it's one I did that is supposed to highlight the feel of writing to me. This is what it feels like. I don't know why it's purple, but that felt right at the time. So again, for those only listening, I will describe this to you. These are two hands. They're my hands, which is why they're covered in scars, but that's not a story for today. And there's a sort of ethereal, pinkish purple, I am partially colourblind, don't hold me to that, sort of rope looping around and through the fingers. It's sort of like a tangled mess, to be quite honest, which says a lot about my writing process, in a way. And then there's all this sort of almost confetti-like or star-like sparkle above, all of that sort of raining down. It's a very sort of magical type piece, and that is how it feels. It does feel like sort of weaving, tangling and untangling magic in a weird way. That's kind of how it feels to me, and I never got anything close to that with plotting. It was always very clinical, very scientific, very much, okay, we follow the bullet points, and it was... That's not me. That's not what I'm about. Maybe it works for some people, and they don't end up with something really predictable and bland, but we'll see. Having done that for so many years across a good few different genres, I don't see it. I don't really see how it's possible, but I'm more than happy to be proved wrong. If you think you have a good example of someone you know who's written a hardcore plotted book that is full of twists and turns and super unpredictable, and you'd never see the end coming ever in a million years on the first read, send it my way. I'd be interested to see that. Anyhow, getting back to point, I guess. I want to talk about what's improved specifically in my writing since making the switch. And that is really, characters for absolute sure. Everything now I do is really, really character driven, and I think that works for me. I prefer watching and reading things like that as well. Plot driven, I feel like it's too obvious when things are plot driven. But I have, actual characters who have actual feelings, who make actual decisions about things. I'm more just following what they're telling me they're doing than anything else. And I feel like that makes things feel a lot more organic because, well, it is a lot more organic, so people can tell. And I think it makes me care about things more, so that when I'm in edits, I actually care about doing things properly, because if I don't, then I feel like I'm letting somebody down. That's not just me. I'm letting somebody else down with, for example, the snakebite edits that I'm doing at the moment. By this time this episode goes up, that might well be done. Who knows? The schedule, it does not exist, as I've mentioned before. But with that, if I don't do it right, I've let Hanzo down. Not only me have I let down, I've let down Hanzo, and letting down Hanzo is not okay. Because I've sat with him for months while he's told me about, really, his life story and all his most vulnerable moments, and if I then let him down for being lazy after all that he's done for me, that's a dick move. At best, frankly. And I'm not going to be that guy. So, where the line is with plotting, I have touched on this briefly earlier with the I'll do a self-prompt to a very vague extent if I'm writing short. With long form, it's a little bit different to that, because I do still do the self-prompt thing where I'll know, okay, so the next scene ahead is... Let's just use an example I actually have. We're coming across... These two characters are joining in a battle. That's the next scene, and then it goes into the battle from that. So that's the sort of one-sentence prompt. But because this is long form, I know a couple of extra things that will happen slightly after that, or during that, generally. In this case, not during, although that's somewhat unusual, though not really. Afterwards, I do know the sort of end of the scene, or maybe it's the next scene. I genuinely don't even know yet. If there's one thing I'm really bad at in first draft, and I'll touch on this more in the editing episode when that goes up, scene breaks, paragraphing, really, really, really bad for that. It's not uncommon for me to have... I think, oh gosh, what's the longest stint? It's got to be in Black Executioner, where there are... It's between, I think it's 4 or 5 straight pages where there's no paragraphing. And I think it's 3 different scenes, and there's no break point in the first draft at all. It's just big wall of text. I get too engrossed in what I'm doing and the story that's being told to me that I'm then logging down everything that's going on, all the realizations happening on in the background. Oh right, so that's what this person is doing in the background, and that leads to that, and that leads to this thing that happened in that project, and paragraphing is the first thing that goes out the window. And it's one of those things that's relatively easy to fix in edit, so I don't care that much, but it's pretty funny to look back. Like, genuinely, it's hilarious to look back and think, oh god, yeah, I did just write however many pages with no concept of breaks, because why would I guess? Why would that occur to me? I'm not that guy. You're going back to where the line is, getting back to the point. When it comes to knowing what happens next in long form, I'll know what the next scene is. Maybe the scene after that, but that's 50-50. I'll have a good idea of the ending, usually by... Honestly, if that's getting earlier and earlier, I would have said 20-25k. That's now looking more like 10-15k. I don't know whether that's true across the board or just true of the determined ones now, though. It should be mentioned because I do have a set time scale that each book takes place in now that I know so much more of what the determined ones is about, though it does change a bit in it. It's if I want to yeet chapter 1 into the Shadow Realm, as I've done many a time by now. Again, that'll come up in the editing episode. But I know, Shadow on the Snow is the clearest example of that. It's set, the whole sort of premise of Shadow on the Snow is the Hyukai-Self-Fjordvik War. So I know that it starts at the beginning of the war and it ends at the end. And that's kind of just how it is. And there is a little bit before the beginning, but that sort of doesn't really count because it's like 2 to 4 days before, so in the grand scheme of 5-6 years, that doesn't really matter that much. And that's sort of true with all of the other books as well. Not so much with some. There are a couple where I've thought, okay, does it end here or there? But I still have an idea of what both those places are going to be and what that scene is going to look like. Shadow on the Snow, that is, it's always going to be huge spoilers, obviously. Shadow on the Snow is one I can say absolutely nothing about that scene without just giving absolutely everything away. Well, not everything, but like most things. And so that's a scene I do know the vague premise of that scene, I guess, from pretty much the get-go, although it does vary a bit. I suspect when I move on to projects I'll be doing later, past once I've finished drafting the determined ones even, I can speak, I promise. Be awkward as a podcaster if I couldn't, wouldn't it? But, well, maybe that's a story for another time, we'll get into that at some point, I'm sure it'll come up. But yeah, once I get past the determined ones and into projects where the time frame is less clear, and it's not that they're less intertwined in the future, some of my projects, it's just that it works differently because the characters don't directly interact as much. Because with Mr. Nakagami, Black Executioner, and Snakebite in particular, those three, there are quite a lot of shared scenes towards the end of Miss Nakagami and Snakebite, and in the early portion of Black Execution, and also at the end. Because, Haru, Hanzo, and I are all pretty big players in the sort of politics and government of Hyukai, so they all end up talking to each other at points. Which is something that doesn't happen in the same way later on in the timeline. There are a few characters that do that. I don't want to give anything away yet, because I just don't. There's not necessarily a specific reason for that, because nobody's going to remember by then, but I'm me, and I don't do that. I don't do this thing. There are a few characters who do directly talk to each other, but it's more about, with that project, it's more about the consequences of their actions affecting other characters and what they then end up doing to counteract or circumvent or approach those issues. So that is something that could change very much about knowing what the ending is in advance. With some of those I have an idea already, and I obviously haven't put a single word down for those. That is true of In the Eyes of the Desert as well, which is one of the determined ones, that's Curtis Amia's book. which is one I haven't started, even though he is nagging me like hell to, and has been for years now, and I'm getting really excited about it. But there's a very, very hard end point with that, and there always has been from the very moment it was conceptualized. And sometimes it's like that, sometimes it's really not. As Seen on Stage is the other one of the determined ones I haven't put a single word down for yet, and I think I know where that ends, but it could change quite a lot. So that's always an interesting one. Other scenes I will know. I would sort of figure out far ahead as I'm drafting sometimes, so a good example of this, I guess, in Beneath the Moon, I know at one point, one particular thing Helga is going to do. I may have mentioned this, I mean, it's not a spoiler at all, so I am actually going to just say this one. Look at me, it's character development or growth or something. At one point she's going to throw an axe at a desk. I don't know when this happens, other than it's probably quite late, or why she does it or anything, but I know that scene is going to happen. That doesn't mean I'm going to go ahead and draft that scene now, or draft the ending now. I could do that. I have done what's called a Frankendraft before in Penstemon, and all that has resulted in is frankly a huge editing headache and a nightmare and pain, and I have learned to never do it again. Basically, it's much faster, in my experience, drafting it. Penstemon got done really, really quickly, first draft, but the amount of editing it's taken to get anything even at all consistent, let alone cohesive, and years later, it's never as much of a mess as I think it is, but it's nowhere near as good as it should be, given how many, honestly, hundreds of hours have gone into editing it at this point. And it's just not worth it. I write strictly linearly now, beginning to end. Sometimes I'll miss bits in the middle because it happens in Beneath the Moon. I've missed 3 weeks right at the beginning, and that's gonna be hell for Editor Jade, but I'm not Editor Jade, that's not my problem. It's a healthy attitude, I swear. But yes, going back to consistency, this is something I do have to think about increasingly with how things interact, common scenes I mentioned earlier, and consequences of actions, and when did this thing happen, when did that thing happen, and nowadays on the inside cover of any notebook, because handwrite, I mentioned that before, I'll be doing an episode on that soon. Well, I say soon, but the schedule doesn't exist, so we'll see. The inside cover of my notebooks, I write out basic details. That'll be the working title, who the main character, sort of POV character is, and then any other sort of major characters, be that love interests or whatever. I don't necessarily know who the love interest is, or even if there is one off the bat at that stage, and I'll draw a little really, really crude map of the continent, generally, there as well, just for my own reference. I don't have to keep looking at my phone the whole time, because then I'll get distracted by Twitter and all sorts of that. I'm sure you can all relate. On that note, sometimes with Shadow on the Snow in particular, I'll have a much more detailed map of a particular area. So with Shadow on the Snow, it's the sort of north of Hukai and west of South Yordavik. And with the mountain range, which is where the border is, sort of highlighted, and then there were going, by the end of Shadow on the Snow, there were going to be so many notes on that map of, okay, so-and-so moved here, and then that one was there, and then they joined together here, and then so-and-so died here, and it's going to be a mess such that I probably can't even read it by the end. But it helps a lot. And the other thing I'll have, this is not true of Shadow on the Snow in particular, but this was a big thing for Snakebite and Mr. Nakagami, was I'll have a consistency checker of scenes that directly affect these characters when they happened. Basically, that's about it. It'll be generally only as precise as the year, though at the end of Mr. Nakagami, I did make it a bit more precise than that, just because some ending scenes were very close together, that were all very key, and it had to be perfect first draft or it's going to cause me a complete headache later. And I think it was actually still slightly wrong, which is pretty funny looking back, but it wasn't at the time, I can assure you. And that is as simple as when Haru is 53, X scene happens, and then this scene happens. When Haru is 57, this thing happens. It's nothing more than that, and it is purely to keep consistency. There are no notes on how so-and-so reacts in the scene, or the takeaways they'll have from that scene, or what they do afterwards. It's just mentioning, hey, this thing happens here, don't forget that. Which is just to save myself an editing headache as much as anything else. And then getting into different characters talking, I'm going to be quite honest, I'm not sure I knew... Oh no, I do know what I meant by this. It's not just about the shared scenes. This is me adapting my voice to different characters, because as I've mentioned in I think the introductory episode I mentioned this, but I'll say it again. With the Determined Ones, each of the 8 books is following a different POV character, and I write first person. There'll be an episode on that coming soon. Keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. That might be the next episode after this, provided there are no interviews in between, but that'll probably be a follow-on, just to let you know. Anyway, going back to the point, how many times have I said that this episode? Don't drink every time, you'll get alcohol poisoning. They all come from different POV character, first person, so different voice. And that can really affect consistency of things, because someone like Hanzo is shockingly comprehensive, is really the only way I know of putting it. And this is actually the same for Haru as well, where the first drafts of those books were stupid long compared to how long they are now, compared to the 1.1 draft even, I guess. So the first draft of Mr. Nakagami was over 100k, which is ridiculous for me. I believe the 1.1 draft was 85. So that's how much extraneous, straight up extraneous, no questions asked, completely nonsense, extra information there was. With Snakebite, it wasn't quite so bad. The first draft of that, I believe, was 81k. The 1.1, I think, was 63. So not quite as bad, but that is it's definitely a pretty big difference. Then you have someone like for Black Executioner. He doesn't like to talk about his feelings, like, ever on page or in real life. So the first draft of Black Executioner was 57, which is now actually almost 70 on the dot. So you do get a bit of a problem. There's a side character who appears in Snakebite and Beneath the Moon called Toru, who I've written a few shorts from the POV from. He's even worse, in the sense that he'll just kind of lie about what happened. He'll talk about, okay, so I did this thing, and it went like this. I'll say to him, okay, but that's too easy. There's no way you did something this badass and it went through so smoothly. And he's like, you don't need to know the details. Turns out half the time he's missed out about half, like genuinely about half, of what's actually happened. So that's something that can be a real challenge for consistency and also just voice in general. Because someone like he's a man of few words. He doesn't like to talk very much. He struggles with talking. He actually has mutism, because trauma is fun. Trauma is so much fun. But then someone like Haru, he's not a chatterbox, but he can be quite chatty, so you end up with, I mean, it's kind of by definition you're going to end up with a lot more words just because of that. But that goes through into not only dialogue, internal monologue and descriptions and all sorts, where I will look at something, Nagashima, and he'll think, it's big, it's grey. Whereas Haru will think, oh, that's grey in the same way that X thing is, and that's big in this kind of way, and Nagashima just doesn't have those thoughts in the same way. And that sort of inconsistency, I think, is what makes the Determined Ones what it is. It's what makes it so charming, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. Is that everything is that bit different in kind of just every detail, every way. I think that is probably about all I have to say about pantsing. As I mentioned, future episodes are going to be, that are related to this, are going to be editing, handwriting I've mentioned a few times, writing in first person POV. Again, we don't want any bashing of writers' processes. I'm going to state that again in the comments because I know how toxic and how heated the debate around plotting versus pantsing can get. No process is invalid. You write what works for you, in the way that works for you. The last thing I do want to mention, as always, if you are published or on the way, please do get in touch if you want an interview on this podcast, because I will do that. I am at jblack21 on Twitter, that is where I spend most of my time. If I don't reply to your DM in good time, then chances are I haven't seen it because Twitter has decided I don't need to, so just pop me an email, jade42black@gmail.com. You can contact me in the first place that way if you prefer that. If and when you contact me, please include, and this will be in the description like always, the title of your book, the age category, the genre, and a little bit about it, be that a blurb or a synopsis. Doesn't have to be fully polished, bullet points are fine. That's all good. If you are indie or self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from. Please contact me. If you are trad pub, that does not mean I won't talk to you necessarily. Whether you get on the podcast or not is down to my own discretion, no arguments. I'm the only one doing this, so that's how it's going to be. It depends purely on whether I think it's a good format, it's a good fit for the podcast or not. That may or may not depend on what people who watch and or listen think, what they want to hear, or what I am interested in talking about, whatever. So don't get too precious about it, basically. It's the long and short of it. But for now, that is all, and you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like and or subscribing to the channel if you don't want to miss out on future content. Copyright J Black 2023.